So we're going to talk briefly about the cultural triangle. And this is work that we've done based on the work by a linguist named Lewis. We've modified it a bit to fit our own setting. First of all, I want to say that as a motivation for this, our belief is that we are wonderfully made. And in that, we recognize we are made different from each other, and we can see that obviously physically. We believe culturally that is also true, and one of the challenges that we sometimes have is when we see people who engage in the world differently from the way we do. We can either think there's something wrong with us, or we can think there's something wrong with them. And part of what the work of Lewis has done for us is helped us to recognize the good differences that are there. And so that the way I engage in the world is a good way in so many ways in how to engage in the world, and that can be true of others as well. So rather than judge, I can recognize the differences and, in fact, wonderful good in the differences. And so what Lewis does is he creates a triangle. And at each point in this triangle, he puts a culture. And so if we start up at the top, here he puts cultures that tend to be emotional. They tend to be very energetic. They tend to be louder. And sometimes when people look at them, they look like it's very chaotic. We call cultures like this expressive cultures because they're cultures that are quick to express themselves and express themselves boldly and enthusiastically. At another point in the triangle, Lewis describes cultures that tend to be more logical. They tend to emphasize productivity, so they're productive cultures. There is less emotion, and often there's a push to do just one thing at a time, to keep things organized and clean, so just one thing. And for a culture like this, we speak of them as analytical cultures. And then a third kind of culture, down in the other corner, is a culture that tends to be quieter. They tend to be slower to speak. And a key thing about these cultures is there's an emphasis in watching the others. So there's a lot of emphasis on paying attention to each other and how people are being cared for and their honor being protected. And we speak of cultures like this as reflective cultures. What Lewis does is then identify a culture that's a good example of each of these. And so before I say that, I just want to say that we find this model to be what we would call a useful oversimplification. It's clearly an oversimplification that these descriptions are not all there is to these cultures. There's so much more that different cultures can be. So it's clearly an oversimplification. And yet we found it useful because it, in effect, broadens our own sense of the range of cultures and ways to understand each other. And so it's useful, but we have to be cautious. We don't want to oversimplify, which we've done. So we want to be cautious about how we use this. Yet it's been very helpful to us. And so to illustrate, Lewis identifies Italian culture as a good example of an expressive culture. And perhaps you have one in your own mind as you've been hearing this description. As an example of an analytical culture, Lewis identifies German culture and being a good one of an analytical culture. And then of reflective cultures, Lewis identifies the Vietnamese. And so this idea that no culture is entirely or purely an expression of one of these three. We're all some sort of mixture of things. And so as an illustration of that, Lewis picks the United States and says, broadly speaking, the U.S. culture tends to be very analytical and productive, yet it's pretty loud about it. It's expressive. Whereas Canadian culture, he says, it's also a rather analytical culture, but more reflective about it, perhaps a little bit slower to speak up and a little bit slower to express an opinion. And so all of us fit somewhere in this triangle, or perhaps in interesting combinations beyond it, as a result of multiple things. So it seems to us that we are each the product of a culture in which we grew up, and in some sense we extend that culture to speak of the family we grew up in. And then also we have our own personality. And certainly other things influence it, but that means we each end up somewhere in a variation like this. And so in our own church, we've discovered that some of us are very expressive people. It's not hard to tell what the expressive people think. And it's not hard to tell what they feel, because this is something they will express, and a wonderful way to be able to share with others. Some of us are very analytical people. Some of us want to know the rationale. They want to know the data. They want to be able to talk things through and keep emotion out of it, so that we can just stay in the analysis mode. And some of us in our church are very reflective people, slower to speak and perhaps slower to come to conclusions, watching out for each other. And so we see in this that we've got people who tend toward different parts of this diagram, and it's a useful thing for us to better see that. And in one way that we have come to see is that we want the influence of all of these, because these are not moral categories. They're variations, that it's not immoral or more moral to be more reflective or expressive or analytical. It's different, and what we find very rich and valuable for us is to bring the multiple cultures together in helpful ways that broaden the experience that we each have. In future videos, I'll talk about how we then use these categories to help us better understand how we interact together as a church.